Hi and welcome to your psychology podcast. This series is dedicated to sorting out social phenomena and approaching them with psychological theories. Today, the topic we're going to discuss is related to love and childhood trauma, a theme that our generation can hardly bypass. Just very recently, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who had a hardship with her romantic relationship. She was having a crush over a boy which she thought did not like her in return despite all the efforts she made. She was depressed and devastated, but at the same time, she said she enjoyed the painful feeling of constantly being rejected. While this may sound bizarre, but her belonging for love, or should we say to be loved, as well as her reliance on suffering emotionally to gain pleasure, is in fact not an uncommon case. Now, there is nothing bad with hoping for love, but my friend, and for many others, may have been trapped by the compulsive or even morbid pursuit of it to the point that their everyday lives are very much impacted. As my friend turned to me for help, I started thinking, this is not the first time I run into someone who have similar issues. There should be many, although I cannot name a specific figure, including myself at least once, who spent much of their lifetime searching for a solid attachment to someone else. If you're fond of ethnographic studies or simply take observation as a hobby, it is not difficult to identify such examples. But if to think further, why is this the case? To find an answer, we need to rewind a little to recall what happened when we were first exposed to love. As a keen researcher, I conducted an autoethnography, so just a very brief reflection about my childhood experience. It didn't take me much time to realize that for a very long period of time, I had the same problem as what my friend is currently having. Before entering high school, I was always seeking for relationships to make me feel secure. My obsession with creating an intimate bond with someone else stems very largely from the fact that I constantly felt lonely. As my parents were absent for the significant part of my life, and I did not have much contact with them growing up. Perhaps, I thought, the bond I was trying to make with others is in fact an attempt to compensate for the absence of intimacy that I was supposed to obtain from my parents. While this is more than a personal conjecture, of course, it is in line with how psychologists construe the prevailing phenomenon that young people nowadays keep finding themselves emotionally attached and sometimes addicted to relationships, judging partly from the significant growth of dating app use. And speaking of this, there's something that we need to know first. Many personality issues and behaviors in adulthood are rooted very much in problematized childhood experience. And our case is no exception. Psychiatrists approach this phenomenon from the perspective of child development psychology, a study on how our early experience shapes adult lives based on nuances and changes at a neural level. One of the psychiatrists, Gabriel Mart, believes that the lack of robust, intimate connection to one's parents as a child produces inner insecurity in that child that can persist to adulthood, and that the building of such connection requires bodily contact. Physical contact such as petting, touching, and hugging are the means through which chemicals from each other, so the child and the parents, are exchanged and captured, especially by the brain of the former, which reacts to such signal and develops differently from when the signal is absent. This process is also vital to how the feeling of love is formed for both parties. And going back to my friend's case, she disclosed to me that she had a complex feeling about the love her parents have for her. It is often authoritative, replete with exchanges of conditions and interests, but intense at the same time. She was able to relate her issues with love and vulnerable subjectivity. As mentioned, she somehow feels alive when being rejected. To her relationship with her parents when she was young. She said she wanted so much to prove that she was worthy of love. This was developed through the responses she received when she was little, when her emotional needs were ignored, and it translated into a habit as an adult and in her each relationship. This is not necessarily saying that her parents did not love her, but simply that their love did not lead to an establishment of a robust, intimate relationship, because it is not conveyed in the way that was intelligible and penetrable to the child, for it was largely conditional and volatile. And as a consequence, her desire for love as a child was not satisfied, and that itself leads to trauma. But what we are looking for today is more than that. We now know that childhood experience, especially that we had with our parents, affect our behaviors as adults. At the same time, if we take a step back to centralize parents, we may have a different picture. Since adult behaviors are shaped by childhood experience to a large extent, either consciously or unconsciously, what we are experiencing as trauma may be indirectly attributed to what our parents once experienced from their parents. We may ask the question, how did their parents raise them? Because they're most likely to have picked up child rearing from their parents. We can say that childhood trauma is in fact an intergenerational issue, as it passes down from one generation to another. Well, an interesting saying about this is that an individual, if to become a parent, would either imitate or completely avoid imitating the way he or she is raised when the trauma is present. They would imitate because that's the only way they know. They avoid imitating because they suffered and resented it, which can, however, lead to another type of problematized parenting. Of course, we know that familial factors are not the only factors shaping one's parenting style. Other factors, such as school education, also have a role to play. But the effect of the former is salient when the trauma is unresolved. As a consequence, parents with unresolved childhood trauma often have children with traumatized experience, and the cycle continues. But the issue is also generational. We may take a cultural account to look at it. In the Western countries such as the US, childhood trauma and bad parenting are often related to societal problems such as massive drug abuse or exorbitant alcohol consumption. In East Asian countries, the fact that children's mental well-being does not receive attention and that the elder generation have hardly been educated on how to raise a child, who continue to adopt an authoritative principle in child rearing, are perhaps what lead to the prevalence of childhood trauma. Studies have validated this argument and pointed out that our generation, so the Generation Z, is largely infected with trauma. Regarding its consequences, the morbid pursuit for love is perhaps just one example. Childhood trauma is linked to various psychological disorders, including hyperactivity disorders, depression, and anxiety. And these are probably the most common issues our society are faced with nowadays. Well, these consequences, some of you may be aware, others not. But many evade confrontation and turn to other types of intimate relationship as an alternative. This process is different from a normal relation building because it is not equivalent. In many cases, at least one party would demonstrate low self-esteem, strenuous endeavor to prove oneself worthy, great vulnerability to changes, and high demand for love. However, they were not to be blamed because that's their coping strategy, an act of self-protection and saving. Confronting the reality can be harsh, most likely involves an enduring, perhaps lifelong process of negotiation, arduous efforts and pain. But is there ways we can reconcile this? Well, to resolve any issue, we must first be able to identify it. So if you think you have similar behaviors as described above, perhaps you can do a brief self-reflection of your childhood experience. Think it as a small activity that allows you to spend time with yourself. Explore how your childhood experience shapes your life. Often, we let our attention disperse across the external discussions such as beauty and politics and neglect our inner feelings as a result. Introspection keeps you away from external distractions for a moment and helps you understand yourself better. What you can think during this process is, what are the reasons behind my important decisions? If you have a partner, what kind of relationship are you having? What are the routine interactions? Could that have something to do with my childhood experience? For example, lack of intimate relationship during one's childhood can lead one to pursue attachment, often at the expense of one's selfhood. Ask yourself questions and think hard. Try to locate the root of your behaviors. A deep thinking can take much time and effort, but it will be worth it. If you recognize, like my friend does, that you are having troubles with some aspects of your life because of your experience as a child, perhaps you may want to have a conversation with your parents and disclose your thoughts when you're prepared. Now, psychiatrists have different opinions with respect to solutions to childhood trauma. Some believe in negotiation and communication. Others find detachment and self-forgiveness essential. They may all work, essentially, but it really depends on specific contexts. So you may want to try them to see which one really applies to you. But regardless of which approach you take, keep in mind that you've been marvelous confronting the trauma. Give yourself some level of recognition as you deserve it. I would like to remind you, however, that be cautious of the labeling effect. Childhood trauma should not be seen as an excuse for anyone to bound themselves up, but to empower and keep one forward. Ever since the pandemic, there has been an explosion of discussions over the health issues that are mounting in our society. This, of course, is attributable to the post-COVID symptoms, depressed economy, and long-lasting quarantine that deprives many of their daily interactions important to their well-being. But when we're talking about public resistance to negative emotions such as depression, we often overlook its fundamental association with child development. In a culture where generational issues are unavoidable, it is prevalent that emotional needs, or even the basic needs of bodily contact with our most loved ones, are often not met. For we don't know the connection between such contact and our well-being, we may fall into self-blaming and internalize negative responses. Therefore, what this podcast is trying to emphasize is the significance of recognition and then resistance. To be able to recognize your past as what shapes who you are, to affirm everything you've done for self-protection and healing, and to resist being confined by the past. And you are not alone on this track, for childhood trauma is an issue to which the whole generation and those of elder times should be attending.